Now I'm going to cover the useful expressions part for in the classroom. So, if you're wondering, most of these are flat. So, kokuban is flat. Tsukue is also flat. Keshigomu also flat. Isu flat. Enpitsu flat. And then the rest of these, I'm not sure how helpful this is, but this whole area is all atamadaka, and all of these are flat. So, kokuban, flat. Tsukue, flat. Keshigomu, flat. Enpitsu, flat. Isu, flat. Mado, atamadaka, head high. Jisho, head high. Hon, same deal. Door, same. Denki, same. And then katen. Also, so if I'm going to go through and put the marks here, looks like this. Oh, nothing there. Oh, yeah. So, and then we can move on to the vocabulary. So, again, as I've talked about, a lot of these are words we've already covered, I believe. I'm not sure, but eiga. I believe it used to be eiga. I'm not sure which way it goes, but either way, nowadays it's eiga or eiga. Either is fine. So maybe I'll say we have an optional accent here. Ongaku is head high. I should be using a left hand. You can't see with the shono. Zashi is flat. All of these, as you can see, we're getting away from the exceptions to the katakana rules. All of these are technically to be pronounced with accents 3 from the end, and you can likely get away, and you will likely hear. You can likely get away with, and you will likely hear native say sports deido tennisu terebi. So you can basically take your pick here. I think with katakana words, a big reason why I try not to focus on them is because you have quite a lot of freedom, and I think there's a certain amount of, how would you say it? There's a certain amount of unsteadiness, I think, for Japanese natives using these words. I think they're relatively subject to change quite easily. So don't stress too much about these. These words are all standard. Same thing here, ice cream. Same rule. I think, and the same thing here. And then here we have our special long vowel, which means it moves back here. Hamburger. And I think in both of these cases, they're long enough, I wouldn't recommend flattening them. So I wouldn't recommend saying ice cream or hamburger. Even if maybe you could get away with it, I wouldn't count on it. And it's hard to get good resources about this. There's really nothing to do but basically either listen to people in person or sit and click through Youglish for, quite a while to make sure you have enough data. There's not really... In dictionaries, you're not going to see this new flattening because that's still not been officially recognized. Osake. I believe sake itself is flat. I can check that while I'm talking about this, but osake is definitely flat because I checked earlier. And it's a good opportunity, even though it doesn't happen here, to talk about this sort of politeness showing particle here. Not sure if particle is the right word, maybe prefix. But a lot of times, sake was flat. A lot of times, with words with different accents, o changes the accent. And if a word has o at the beginning, you can be pretty sure the accent is either going to be flat or right after o. So the flat word shigoto becomes oshigoto. Whereas jozu, which is odaka, so jozu desu, although I wouldn't recommend saying that, becomes ojozu desu. The o gets rid of that final high accent because the two options with o tend to be the accent right after o or no accent at all. So just bear that in mind. Here it's flat, same thing with ocha. And then we get on to kohi. Remember the 3 accent rule? Here's another exception where it moves one forward, or maybe one later is the less confusing phrasing. So kohi. nothing really to see there. Mizu is flat. Don't say mizu and don't say mizu ga. It's mizu ga, mizu o. It's flat. And with all the gohan, as you can see if you count, they are all 5 mora long. So each one, and I checked earlier, so I wouldn't waste any more of your time. Each one is asa gohan, hiru gohan, and ban gohan. And while we're here, because I don't think many of them are on the rest of the page, I'll talk about the asa, hiru, and ban. I don't think ban actually gets used much, but I'll check real quick. Maybe it does. I've not heard this used on its own, but it's flat if it is said on its own. Whereas asa is high-low. Asa, asa. That should be relatively intuitive for English speakers. And then hiru is odaka. Again, 2 more words. You're going to see a lot of your odaka words there. So, hiru ni, hiru o, hiru wa. So, keep a lookout for this and this. I wouldn't worry too much about ban because I have not heard it my entire time with Japanese, on its own at least. So, ie, and of course this is one of the tricky ones because it's with the same character. Ie is also odaka. Ie ni, ie wa. And then uchi, as I talked about in a previous lesson, I believe. I looked over this before recording the lessons, so I might not have actually, but uchi is relatively complicated because on its own, just saying uchi wa, it's flat. But if it's modified, for instance, tomodachi no uchi ni itta, then it develops an accent. This class of words, I know it's kind of frankly a pain in the ass, but there's only 5 ones where it's, at least, let me make sure I know what I'm saying. There's only 5 words where it's mandatory to do this, even though I've encountered more words where you can. You only really have to memorize 5. But uchi is just uniquely tricky because it's also used to sort of modify the meaning of verbs. So, for instance, tabeteru uchi ni, in which case, loses the accent again. So, this is going to be quite a bit of a pain, but just remember, uchi becomes uchi, like with the accent there, even though, of course, a native wouldn't say it that way. Uchi ga, when it's on its own, uchi ga, when it's modified, and then uchi ni, for instance, when it's modified, when it's modifying a verb. So just give the word uchi the side eye whenever you go past him, because he's a bit of a trickster. Gakko is flat. And I've talked quite a bit in the last few lessons about the tendency of 2 Chinese readings becoming head-high accented, atamadaka. But I very much doubt this is going to happen here for a specific reason, because I was reading a study the other day which found that in words, for instance, like ongaku, even though ongaku is already accented, but in flat words like that, the tendency for Japanese natives is to put an accent where there isn't one, rather than to lose an accent where there should be one. But that trend reverses when, instead of having a long vowel, it has a long consonant. So, for instance, words like kokka have a tendency to be mispronounced, well, whether you call it mispronouncing is quite subjective, but it tends to be pronounced as kokka. For instance, the accent is lost rather than a new one is added. So, the trend with words like this that have the small tsu is actually to be flat rather than head high. So I doubt you're going to hear this said as gakko, at least from natives. So gakko, there's that one. And then kafe, this is accented. With the general trend of flattening foreign words, I wouldn't be surprised if you heard kafe, but I have not heard it myself, and so I recommend definitely saying kafe because it's doubtful whether this word is specifically being affected by this broad trend. It's very likely that it's just staying as kafe. Now we're on to some more native Japanese words. So ashita is odaka. It's astani. Astawa. Any particle attaches low, which means this ends up being high. You can think of it, what's a good way to put it? If we make this little high spot, it's high because it's dropping, and it sort of pulls up, the rest sort of leads up to it. You can imagine if there's sort of a blanket, and you're lifting part of it up. On the right side, it's a sharp drop, and on the left side, it's actually pulling it up. Maybe it's easy to think of it as sort of a bike ramp, but that's the shape you're going to be listening for. That's the sound of Japanese, essentially. So it's ashitawa, ashitawa. So I very much recommend memorizing this. And then kyo is atamadaka. And I've already mentioned asa. Konban is also atamadaka. We're getting sort of a little spree here. And then this character, mai, when it's put on things, to mean every, it always makes the word atamadaka. So that can just make your life a little easier. Mainichi, maiban. And then shimatsu is flat. There's no accent here. We've broken the streak. Shimatsu is flat. And then when we get to the days of the week, we're in luck because they all have the accent. 3 from the end. Doyobi. Nichiyobi. Just one go and you've memorized them all. And then itsu is a question word. So as I've talked about question words before, it is high-low. Itsu. Atamadaka. But you're likely going to hear it pronounced low-high as well. Don't freak out. And then goro gets us into a sort of category of words that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Because what happens here is whatever words it attaches to, it deletes their accent and creates an accent that's high on go and low on do. So if you're saying nanji, not the old pronoun, I'm not saying like ware nanji, I'm saying like when nanji, and I act. My English might be worse now. When I attach this to it, it becomes nanji goro, or ichiji goro. So just memorize this and notice that trait of deleting the previous accent and then turning it into its own, because you're going to see that more as we go on. And we're finally to verbs, which is what's going to make this quite difficult. So I said in an earlier lesson that the rules about long syllables, even though it seems difficult and it seems like freaky and scary, it makes things a lot easier. Because as we hear it, this is iku, and this is kaeru, and then this is nomu. So you can see, we have an accent 1 from the end, we have 1 3 from the end, and we have no accent, and that seems very overwhelming. But there's actually a very simple rule in standard or Tokyo Japanese, which is a verb will always have the accent either missing, it will either be no accent, or 1 from the end. And you might be thinking, well, you just showed us one that's 3 from the end. But that's because kae is one of those syllables where it can't have an accent, at least not normally. Which means that accent just gets bumped back. So this isn't that, you have to memorize, it's on the ka. Just remember that it has an accent. It's just binary information. Does it have an accent or doesn't it? Because as scary as the syllable rule sounds, it's actually very intuitive for English speakers. Because kaeru is actually quite a bit more difficult for us to say than just kaeru. So blending this into a sort of diphthong comes very natural to us, so don't freak out about it. So you can essentially memorize these by just asking, does it have an accent or doesn't it? So then we get on to the tricky part, because I've mentioned that the accent at the end of words, or no accent at all, is one of the trickiest distinctions. In fact, while I was reading for this, I had misremembered that isu was accented as like isuga, but it's not, it's isuga. So as confidently as I talk, I still make plenty of mistakes. The other tricky part that's equally as difficult is verbs. Because I've talked about how most nouns are flat, so you really only need to remember the 30% which are not flat. The issue with verbs is they're almost 50-50 whether they're accented or not accented. And this affects most of their conjugations. So I really do recommend memorizing, is this verb accented or not, and really committing it to memory. Because over this last year, as I've been really focusing on accent, that is the single biggest struggle I've had is, wait, was this verb accented or not? In fact, I had it the other day of, I believe it's jijimu, I think is the word, where I couldn't remember whether it was accented or not and didn't know whether I was doing it right or not and had to go and look it up. So definitely, as close to the first go through as you can, memorize whether these are accented or not. All that said, let's go through. Iku is flat. Iku, well, I guess I don't need to put that there because I'm only marking the down steps. So iku is flat. Kaeru is accented. And even though it's here, if you remember it as being here, that is totally fine. The same syllable rule will correct it. Kiku is flat. Nomu is also, not also, nomu is accented, as well as hanasu and yomu. In fact, I recommend kind of remembering nomu and yomu as sort of like siblings, because you learn them about the same time. And they're both covering very basic actions that you talk about a lot. So definitely remember yomu and nomu as being accented. And then we get to okiru. This is accented. And then taberu is also accented. Neru, not accented. Miru is accented. So there's a really helpful rule here, by the way. So with 3 more verbs, and you don't have to memorize this right now, just keep it in the back of your mind. So 3 more verbs that have the E vowel in the middle are overwhelmingly accented. There are only 4 exceptions, and I think I remember them. It's kariru for borrow, tariru of be enough, nigiru for grip, and abiru as in taking a shower. If you remember those 3, if you remember those 4, then every other one is going to be, at least every other common one is going to be accented. So you don't need to memorize, oh, was it this or was it that? If you see the E sound in the middle, you've already got it. Then miru, this is just one of those ones you have to memorize. Then kuru, this is actually, I'm going to take a minute to talk about this. Of course, it's irregular, as you can see here, and it is accented. And this so these irregular verbs maintain their accent through their different conjugations. So kuru does become konai. It doesn't become konai the way it would if it was flat. It's konai or korarenai. Or if you're wanting to be a little casual and maybe make your Japanese teacher very mad, say, or make her very sad, say korenai. But the exception here, sort of exception, is the past tense and the te form, because I mentioned those are very much siblings that go hand in hand. Kita and kite. Of course, I'm not pronouncing the vowel, so there's nothing for it to be high and come down for, right? So the question is, what happens here? And the answer is yes, and also no. As to what? Who knows? I'm trying to be a little silly here, but what happens is that energy stays there, but it has to move somewhere. So it either moves back or it moves later, and there's a lot of speaker variation how they do this. So if you're saying like, what's a good example? I think maybe yattekita. Then you could end up moving that power to the te yattekita, or I'm not sure if it happens in this exact combination, but actually move it to the ta or te, like especially when it's on its own, like kitekara. Or perhaps they might say yattekitara, although I don't think that's as likely. This is another one of those things that generally comes all right with instinct if you're just looking out for it. Just remember the power from this sort of energy of this accent, when it's devoiced, is still there. It's just sort of shuffled to the side. So just pay attention to where that goes. Suru is unaccented. In fact, I have a friend who came back and I was very confused why he kept saying like suru or shita until he mentioned that his friends over at Akita had been from the Kansai region where that is suru. But I recommend we all memorize it as suru, being flat. Is it teaching this as a single verb? Hold on. I never thought of it that way. Let me check this. Hold on. Okay, no, this isn't like its own verb. Benkyo is its own noun, and then suru just goes on it to make it a verb. This isn't like its own thing. And of course, benkyo is flat. The reason why I freaked out there for a second and check is because there's another word that technically becomes a verb with suru, which is ai. And the reason this is important to know is because if you were just putting suru on this, it would become ai suru, but it doesn't. It sort of merges into a single word, and this is very rare. As you can see, it's a special class, but it becomes ai suru. So that's why it doesn't become, if you're saying that somebody loves you, you're not saying ai sareta or ai sareteru. You're saying ai sareteru because it's a single verb. And also be careful not to let instances like this confuse the accent of suru, because if you're saying like ai sareru, that's not the same as this. This does not become sareru. This becomes sareru because it's flat. So try not to mix these two kind of instances up. And then moving on to e-adjectives, we've already discussed that you can pronounce them all accented one from the end, no issues. And I believe these are both, even originally accented in that way. Let me check amari because, that's... Okay, so these are adverbs, which means these are the ones you have to look out for because, let's see, except for this one, which can optionally be pronounced with an accent, there might be a catch here. As far as I know, it's pronounced like chotto when it's going before shita, like chotto shita. I think it's normally accented like chotto when it comes before like chotto yatte mita. I think you should do this accented most of the time, except for that exception of chotto shita. But I'm not terribly confident about this. There's not very many good resources for adverbs. Each of these, amari, zenzen, taite, with the exception, I think, of tokidoki. Let me make sure. Oh, this can be pronounced two ways. So optional. I'm learning a lot. And yoku is accented. But all of these unaccented ones have a possibility. I can't say that they do, but they have a possibility that when a particle attaches, that it attaches low. So words such as mattaku, when you put da after them, become mattakuda. Mattakuda. So you have to keep an eye out for these, basically. And I'm still getting used to this rule, as I mentioned in the normal group chat. It's a rule I only finally put together a month or two ago when I found good resources on it. Until then, I was just confused about what I was hearing. All of these we've already covered. So, do desu ka? And then demo and then are both said with an accent. Well, when it's being used to say yes, If you're saying it as like a question, you'll say not accented. So don't get those two mixed up.